in 3, 2, 1.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to ATCO Sustainable Solutions webinar series. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about the project lifecycle of remote community clean energy projects. My name is Filip Palasz. I'm the business development lead for our off-diesel initiative with ATCO, and today I will be serving as your webinar moderator. This is the second webinar in our series, and in case you missed the first one, you can visit our website to watch it anytime. This webinar will also be posted on the website following today's presentation, and we'll pop the web link into the chat for you to bookmark the page. But before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining you today from Whitehorse, Yukon, which is the traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Ta'an Council. However, as many of you are joining from other places across the country, please take a moment to acknowledge the land you are on and the Indigenous people who've been stewards of the land since time immemorial. And I would also like to recognize that tomorrow is Reconciliation Day, Truth and Reconciliation Day, and I'd like to encourage everyone to reflect on what reconciliation means to you personally, not necessarily the corporate perspective, but each of us as individuals and what our roles are within reconciliation. We strongly encourage you to ask questions at any point throughout the webinar using the Q&A panel in Teams. Whether you're on desktop or mobile, you'll find the Q&A drop-down icon in the upper right corner and the full Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You may not see your question published until closer to the end of today's presentation, so don't worry, you don't need to submit your question more than once. If we don't get to all the questions, we will connect with you directly after the webinar. Just make sure you include your name and please try not to post anonymously. At the end of the presentations, we'll include our contact information to connect with us anytime. For those of you who aren't familiar with ATCO, we are a one-stop provider for integrated energy, housing, transportation, and infrastructure solutions. For 75 years, we have worked in more than 100 countries around the world to provide customers with innovative, sustainable solutions in the sectors that are fundamental to global growth and prosperity, such as housing, real estate, energy, water, transportation, and agriculture. From the delivery of efficient and reliable energy for homes, businesses, and communities to affordable temporary and permanent buildings, we build communities, energize industries, and deliver customer-focused solutions across the globe. Building respectful and mutual beneficial relationships with communities, industry, and government has long defined how ATCO does business, and we are always looking for opportunities to better collaborate with communities to better help them meet their goals. We also have a strong commitment to material economic reconciliation opportunities with Indigenous peoples. This is in part why we're holding this series. The sharing of economic benefits on energy projects is a tangible and necessary step towards authentic reconciliation, and ATCO has been an active partner in that space for a long time. In today's webinar, we hope you will walk away with a clear and practical understanding of how to create a plan for implementing a clean energy solution. This will include understanding what that material financial barriers are and why they're there, as well as the considerations from a regulatory, technical, and financial perspective. Furthermore, you will have a better understanding what assumptions should be considered for their projects and how to build a rough economic model. We also have a great speaker from Natural Resources Canada who will walk you through the funding opportunities and their priorities in supporting clean energy projects in remote communities. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters. We have Chris Cunningham, Manager of Regulatory for ATCO, and Amber Clark, Policy Analyst at the Indigenous Remote and Rural Clean Energy Hub for Natural Resources Canada. Chris has an undergraduate degree from the University of Calgary in Engineering and has recently completed an MBA from the University of Alberta. He began his career with ATCO Electric in 2005, working in distribution, standards, and reliability. Over his career, Chris has worked on various distribution, transmission, generation projects in the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and in Alberta. For the past 10 years, Chris has been working with ATCO's regulatory team, specializing on economic modeling, rate design, and general situational challenges. Amber Clark has also joined us today as a policy analyst at Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, with the energy efficiency and technology sector. Amber leads Indigenous engagement with new clean energy for Indigenous and remote communities hub. Ms. Clark has a master's degree in public policy from the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary and has worked with Indigenous policy programs and proponents at NRCan for 2 years. Welcome to you both, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Philip, and thanks everybody for joining us today. My name's Chris, and yeah, we'll go through some of the background, some of the regulatory constraints we see, and hopefully help you get your project on your way. So just to level set things and provide a little bit of background, I think we can all acknowledge that electricity is a fundamental or an essential service that we all rely on in our daily lives. Utilities typically provide that service in accordance with rules and regulations that help ensure that power is affordable, safe, and reliable. And to just provide a little bit of the grid landscape and who are the major players or stakeholders, you always have a government who typically sets an agenda, passes legislation, has budgets, and they run programs as well. Their goals typically align with the social desires, so environmental reconciliation efforts, economic efforts, and health benefits. Regulators, they review utility operations, and they set just and reasonable rates by interpreting legislation and deciding whether utility operations and expenditure are prudent. Utilities have an obligation to serve mandate to provide affordable, safe, and reliable service. Power producers, so the projects we're talking about here today, what'll happen is you'll connect to the local utility grid, generate renewable power, and sell it to the utility. And then the last but not least is ratepayers. So that's all of us. We're all paying utility bills. We all vote on the government, and we're stakeholders in utility affairs. So kind of putting all those stakeholders into kind of a rough map, what does it look like? So government has overall oversight on everything that's going on generally in society. They'll set the legislation and regulations. Those go to the regulator interprets those legislations. They have oversight of the utility, the ratepayers, independent power producers. They have oversight of all of that. And then down at that lower level, how do the kilowatt hours move and how do the dollars flow? Well, the independent power producer will produce kilowatt hours. They'll sell it to the utility. The utility in turn will take that power, run it over the power lines, and deliver it to the ratepayers. In turn, the ratepayers will pay the utility, and the utility will pay the independent power producer. Now, we also have another little line there, or from the government to the independent power producers, because a lot of times these independent power producers, these renewable projects, they're not always economically viable on their own. So these government programs often help to finance or provide grant funding to help make sure that these projects can get off the ground. So a little bit of the technical background. We always need to be conscious about the system performance. So what you need to know, you need to know that at all times the generation is finely balanced with the load or the demand on the grid. So everything that everybody's consuming, there has to be an equivalent amount of generation to make sure that that consumption is met. Now, intermittent renewable power, what that can do is that can cause rapid power fluctuations, which can compromise that fine balance between generation and load. So this would happen on a renewable project with the wind suddenly stops or a cloud covers the solar panels or something like that. So what happens in those events? The diesel generations will have to rapidly ramp up or ramp down to rebalance that generation with load. This can strain the system and can introduce something like power quality issues, which that might be your frequency could change at your power outlet or worse. And to give you an idea of like how much renewable power is generally acceptable. We have a little note in here that says in the NWT, I know the utilities and the government or the regulator kind of work together, and they came up with this number about 20% of the grid coming, or 20% of the grid supply could come from like those renewable sources, those intermittent renewable sources. And that would help ensure that the utility can compensate and make sure that the power remains within the right balance, the generation with the load. The other thing that can happen in order to rebalance is you might need, if for example, you're going to install more renewable energy than that, say that 20% mark, what you might need to do is you might need to add a microgrid controller or battery to help address those rapid power fluctuations. These, in the projects I've seen, these have typically been, they're closely integrated with the utility system, so they all need to work together. So the projects that I've worked on, they were owned and operated by the utility. They're typically very expensive to install, and these costs can also end up compromising the project viability. So back to that intermittent, renewable power is typically intermittent. Well, so that generally means we can't rely on it. So in providing that safe, reliable service, fulfilling that mandate, renewables on their own, typically those intermittent renewables, solar and wind, the utility can't really rely on those for dependable capacity. So that's why in remote communities, we always have diesel power. So diesel power is what we call dispatchable power. It's very dependable, and it allows us to make sure that the power system is reliable, it's safe, we know what we're going to get. So it's very similar to like when you're driving your car, you push the accelerator down and the gas goes into the engine and the engine responds and off you go. It's there when you need it. Yeah, so I mean, generally that diesel power at this point in time, I don't think there's it's needed in all these remote communities. If you think about cold, dark days of the year, the middle of December, you're going to need diesel generation or some form of highly dependable, highly reliable generation. So one of the questions I get a lot coming off of that dispatchable generation comment is, what about all the fixed costs? Well, what are all the fixed costs tied up with diesel generation? How much does it cost to install the plant, install the storage, operate that plant? What are all those costs, and should my renewable project be compensated the same way? And the answer is no, not really. Typically, the utility is constrained. If we go back to those earlier slides where we talk about the regulator reviewing all their operations, if compensation was provided at the same level as all the fixed costs of the diesel, so if for example it costs an extra $2 kilowatt hour to operate all the fixed assets that are involved with providing diesel generation, if that same compensation was provided to a renewable, what that would do is that would increase rate pressure, because at the end of the day, those fixed costs for those diesel generations, all those diesel plants, that can't be avoided. That needs to stay there. So by increasing compensation above what are typically variable costs that would change with the amount of power that is generated in the system, then you're causing that upward rate pressure. The regulator would typically say, hey, that's offside, those costs aren't allowed. So speaking of the variable costs, that's why when you look at the diesel itself, that's why we typically look to that for the compensation. So every kilowatt hour that comes off that renewable generation, that helps us avoid diesel generation. That helps us avoid buying diesel fuel to generate those same kilowatt hours. So without any supporting legislation, utilities will typically look at what's the avoided cost of fuel as a starting point for compensation for IPPs, for renewable IPPs. You typically calculate it in the community you're in by looking at the plant efficiency and the cost of fuel in that community. It can, within a lot of the jurisdictions, it can vary a lot. So, for example, Northwest Territories fuel delivery costs vary significantly from one community to the next community. Some communities are fly-in only, or some communities are only on winter roads. So every community generally has a different fuel cost, so that might affect the cost of power or the compensation that's available for your project. The other important factor to think about when you're looking at your project is you're eventually going to get to a place where you want to have a commercial agreement. So this could be a power purchase agreement or electricity purchase agreement or some sort of formal contract where the utility says, I'm going to buy about this many kilowatt hours for this price, and you're going to deliver this many kilowatt hours for this price. And this adds a lot of benefit for the IPP because it makes sure that you're going to get income for your project over the asset lives. So I've seen power purchase agreements range from 10 to 25 years. Typically, I think solar assets, most people accept that they're going to last about 20 years or more. So I think power purchase agreements they're trending to those longer time periods. So they're good for the IPP because you make sure you have that income. For the utility, it's also good because it helps ensure that we're going to have supply available, or the utility will have supply available to deliver to its ratepayers, and the utility can roughly plan around that supply over the time. These agreements, they generally have some key terms in it. So obviously price is a really key term, but then they'll also have some other nuance to it. So what happens if the power line is unavailable and the plant is generating, but the plant can't generate and deliver into the system? So it usually addresses all these complications that could happen. So they typically involve lawyers and consultants, and this also adds cost to your project. The last thing you need to think about, in my opinion, is that these commercial agreements, they always need to be transparent with the regulators. So everything that the utility does ultimately can be examined and reviewed by the regulators. So everything needs to be very transparent, very clear. You typically always have to write these contracts and execute these contracts according to the existing constraints within the jurisdiction you're operating in. And the last thing is the regulators are always typically what we call economic regulators. So they're always trying to make sure that utilities are acting in the best interest of, they're looking for low cost alternatives. So they're looking to make sure that these commercial agreements aren't causing undue upward rate pressure. So they're not making rates increase in communities. So when you consider all the technical constraints, the logistics of delivering to a remote community, the commercial agreements, and all that added complexity to build these renewable projects, that's typically where you say, well, there's a lot of cost here. And for the projects that I've been involved with, government involvement was always necessary. So you'll see legislation being passed that says, okay, well, this is how you treat a renewable project. Or you'll see the government provide some sort of grant funding to help make sure it gets off the ground. Or you'll see a combination of both. In fact, the projects that I've been involved with typically have both. They'll have the legislation, and the government also steps in with some grant funding. Grant funding applications, they can be really time consuming and complex. But the good thing is Amber is here to discuss some of these grant funding processes in part 2 of this webinar. So just a high-level jurisdictional review. The legislation in the Yukon, this is a legislation that I think is really clear. It's a good example of some of the things we've been talking about previously in this webinar. The legislation in the Yukon, it's Order in Council 2019-25, and it covers off a lot of these material items. So they set the price. They say the price is the last 5-year average fuel price in that community. It also allows for any avoided maintenance that the utility might see. And it also has an inflation adjustment factor. So when you're looking at signing a contract, you'll say, okay, well, what's the average 5-year price? And then you can model out for 20 years what you expect to make in terms of income based on the production at your facility. So it also covers the term in that legislation, which is 20 years. It also allows the utility to recover some of its costs. So the purchases it makes for the kilowatt hours, it allows the utility to recover those. It covers off the utility's third-party costs, so consulting costs, legal costs, some of these items that without the legislation, they'd be more up in the air maybe on how they would get approved. It also covers, this last bullet is really important. So cost of maintaining or replacing equipment required to purchase electricity under the agreement. So this is a big material item. So this is a battery or microgrid controller. So at the outset of the project in the Yukon, what happens is the proponent, the IPP, they'll have to put a contribution towards the microgrid controller and battery. And then the microgrid controller and battery will be integrated into the utility system. Once it's integrated into the utility system and it's operating, well, in 10 years, let's say the battery is end of life. Well, then this last bullet, the cost of maintaining or replacing equipment, this allows the utility to replace that asset, maintain that asset, do everything it needs to make sure the entire power system is operating optimally. So it's a really important bullet that is good for utilities to have, and it's good for the IPP to have. So the IPP knows, hey, in 10 years when that battery stops working, I don't have to buy another battery. So it helps add that clarity to what your project financials are going to be over time. So in Alberta, there's also legislation passed. So we have the small scale generation regulation in Alberta. So again, it covers off some of these material items that we always want to be conscious of when we're thinking of our projects. So it sets the purchase price. In Alberta, it sets the pool price. The government has reasons for setting it there. And it also allows that second bullet there, that's also addressing the battery microgrid controller. It allows the utility to invest in upgrades required to accept energy from the community generation. So in Alberta, it's a little different than the Yukon. So in Alberta, what can happen is the utility can invest in upfront in that battery and then integrate it with its system. And again, once it's integrated into the system, the utility has an obligation to provide safe and reliable power. So they'll be maintaining that battery as long as the IPP is operational. So Northwest Territories, there is no specific legislation at this time for IPPs. However, there are three existing power purchase agreements, which generally follow the principles that we've discussed above. So the big one there is the purchase price is typically the avoided cost of fuel. And then similarly in NUNAVUT, doesn't have a final IPP policy yet. But an amended IPP policy is expected to be submitted to Cabinet by the end of this year. So if your project's in NUNAVUT, this is a really important thing for you to keep your eye on, to form your financials and kind of figure out what costs you might be faced with and how to integrate that into your financial model. So overall, like just at a high level, some of these considerations that you need to have, where are you going to be installing this, and what's the legislation? What are the jurisdictional constraints for your project? You need to know how long is your system going to last, and what's going to happen after that commercial agreement. Are you going to have to salvage something? So salvage costs sometimes can be fairly expensive. So some of the income that you make, you might need to set it aside for a future salvage, or maybe you want to rebuild or upgrade at the end of the life. You'll be wanting to figure out what to do with some of that income. You'll be wanting to make sure that you have money set aside for at that tail end of the project to make sure that you can take care of some of the costs at that point. You need to know what your annual production is going to be. You're going to need to know, well, is it going to degrade over time? So a solar plant, for example, it might degrade at 0.25% a year. So when you're thinking about what your income is going to be, you want to make sure that you factor that in, because even though 0.25% doesn't sound like a lot, year over year, when it compounds over 20 years or 25 years, however long your contract is, your income is going to change a little bit by the time you're in that last year, right? So that's always a real key consideration. You make sure you know what your operating costs are going to be. So you're gonna have a pretty good idea what your income is going to be based on the avoided cost of fuel typically. And then you need to make allowances for operating costs. So how many times are you gonna have to wipe snow off your solar panels, or what's routine maintenance on your wind turbines? So you'll need to make sure you account for that in all your economic models. If there's admin or overhead costs, you'll need to include all those costs as well. You have to think about damaged equipment as well. Who's going to replace it at what cost? Do you need to get insurance for your project? That's another important one there. And then last but not least, you'll want to know if there's any grant funding available to offset your original investment. And luckily we have Amber here from NRCan, and she's going to walk us through that process.
Hi, thank you, Chris and Philip, and thank you, ATCO, for having me here today. As mentioned, I work with the new Indigenous and Remote Clean Energy Transition Hub, which has taken on a new approach to federal funding that addresses some of the accessibility and complexity concerns that Chris mentioned. Today, I'm going to share with you more about the hub and other federally funded clean energy opportunities. I'm also joined with my colleague, Melanie St. Georges, who is a program officer with Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. She'll be happy to support any program delivery questions that you may have. So to start us off today, I'm going to provide a quick high-level overview of diesel use in remote communities. There are 200 communities that use diesel for heat and power. Of these communities, the majority are Indigenous communities. These communities span over all of Canada and therefore have very diverse needs and resources within their communities. Although diesel is reliable, it creates many environmental, social, and economic challenges. Community ownership of renewable energy assets promotes economic reconciliation and energy sovereignty. There are many different clean energy funding programs within the federal government, with levels of their role in supporting Indigenous clean energy programs. These departments include Natural Resources Canada, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, Indigenous Services Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, various regional development agencies, and Infrastructure Canada. There are 3 core programs, which include clean energy for rural and remote communities, which is also known as the CERC program, the Northern Responsible Energy Approach for Community and Heat and Electricity program, which is also known as Northern Reach, which falls within Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, and then the Indigenous Off-Diesel Initiative, which is also known as IODI. Both IODI and CERC fall within Natural Resources Canada. However, we are now introducing a new interdepartmental approach in addition to the existing clean energy programs. In the next slides, I'll go further into details about this new approach to programming. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, we have now introduced this new interdepartmental approach, the Indigenous and Remote Clean Energy Transition Hub. This new approach takes on a community-centered and relationship-based approach. It has opened up flexible timelines and has hands-on support. It focuses on Indigenous climate leadership, seeks to remove barriers like some of the concerns that Chris mentioned earlier with government grant funding, and it strives to meet communities where they're at. And it also involves ongoing engagement and continuous improvements. So the hub is actually a temporary name. I know it's a bit of a tongue twister, but we're actually in the process of undertaking a traditional naming process over the next few months to develop an elder-guided name for this new approach to funding. So you may be asking, what is this hub? So this hub takes on a single window approach to streamline access to reducing diesel programming for remote and Indigenous communities, and it is supported by the $300 million announced in the Strengthen Climate Plan. The hub will bring together the core reducing diesel programs under a single banner, Northern Reach, CERC, and IODI. So this will improve federal coordination in the reducing diesel space. But as we saw earlier, there are still a number of clean energy programs that fall outside of the hub. As a result, pathfinding is a key function of the hub. Program officers will work to identify other programs that could support the project and bring them together using that community-centered approach that I mentioned. The Clean Energy for Rural and Remote Communities program, CERC, and Northern Reach will continue to exist in the background, but externally they will appear as a single program, and there'll be a common application and reporting process. We have also better aligned our program terms and conditions and made them more flexible. The hub will use an ongoing intake approach, so there will no longer be specific or seasonal intake deadlines for applicants. The core hub departments are Natural Resources Canada, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, and Indigenous Services Canada, with partner departments, Infrastructure Canada, and Environment and Climate Change Canada, supporting this new approach to clean energy programming. So the hub is taking on an Indigenous supported approach to decision making. Part of this will be actioned through the hub's Indigenous Council, who will provide advice, recommendations, and be a part of the decision making process on policy and program design. The Indigenous Council will take on a distinctions-based approach, meaning representation will come from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The Indigenous Council will also lead broad community-level engagement and further implementation of Indigenous climate leadership. So before I share some of the resources and we open up for your questions, I wanted to share an example of a successful project that was funded through the Clean Energy for Rural and Remote Communities CERC program in partnership with the Government of Alberta and ATCO Electricity. The project lead, Three Nations Energy, is a limited partnership between Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, Mikisew Cree First Nation, and the Fort Chipewyan Métis Association. They collaborated with ATCO Electric to construct a 2.35 megawatt solar system and a 1.5 megawatt hour battery storage to reduce diesel consumption in the community of Fort Chip. The project provided training opportunities and employment for community members. And since the three communities formed Three Nations Energy and developed this solar project, Three Nations Energy has gone on to lead other sustainability related projects in the community, such as providing solar systems for an off-grid cabin, energy efficiency upgrades, and a local sustainable food center and a local biomass fuel supply company. This project is an excellent example of how our funding can work with utilities and provincial and territorial governments to develop sustainable opportunities for Indigenous and remote communities. So while we open up the floor for questions, I wanted to provide a few resources for everyone, and we can have these shared directly with you. So at the very top is a link to our new Indigenous and Remote Clean Energy Transition Hub. On that website, you can find a link to our contact form, which is a really great opportunity for you to get in touch with program officers directly, so that if you have any questions or want more information about a potential project that you would like to apply for, you can be directly connected with a program officer that is based out of your region. And then we also have right below here an email that directly gets you in contact with folks in our hub. And then in the yellow, we also have some more opportunities for more clean energy federally funded programs that fall under Environment and Climate Change Canada. And then, yeah, the last, just another link for you to find more about Indigenous climate and environment federal funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Chris and Amber. This concludes the formal part of our presentation, and we'll now take it over to some question and answers. And our first one comes from Nick. I think this is for you, Chris, but the question is 20% a conservative estimate? Has it been verified? I assume this references renewable penetration, a comment you made earlier.
Yeah, so the 20%, that would be an engineering estimate back in the time. So I know technology. So I think that was agreed to by the utilities and the regulator in 2014. So I know that technology has changed, and power quality coming out of the renewable systems may be a little bit better now. And I think there have been more recent studies that have been proposed where that capacity might be higher. They haven't been adopted anywhere that I know of. And I think what you'll find with in general with the utilities and with utility service is that there is generally a bent towards a conservative approach rather than trying to be too aggressive with adopting, say, the intermittent power, just because they're always conscious of that mandate to provide the safe, reliable service. So as you go more and more, as you rely more and more on intermittent energy, you're definitely maybe taking a bit, you might be taking a bit more risk on being able to deliver on that mandate, that safe, reliable service mandate. So generally, yes, utilities will act a little bit more conservatively when it comes to some of these limits. And but like I said, I believe that one was from 2014, and it hasn't been updated to my knowledge. And I think there's different views, but at the end of the day, the key is always making sure that the electricity is delivered in a reliable way, in a safe way.
Thank you, Chris. Next question comes to us from Jorge, and it is, I work with some Indigenous communities that have not signed treaties or are not affiliated to any recognized group. How does this affect their capacity to access government funding to stop using diesel and afford greener solutions?
Yeah, thank you, Jorge, and thank you for reading that question out, Philip. So I would still encourage you to have either yourself or the folks that you're working with in the community that you're working with to reach out to the contact form on our hub website, and I can share that in the Q&A. Our funding is not limited only to communities that have signed treaties. So if your community that you're working with is off grid, I would encourage them to fill out a contact form that like I mentioned, I'll share the link to that, and they can better answer some of these direct questions with the program officer and support that application process, and as well connect them with pathfinding services if their project does not necessarily fall within our eligibility criteria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amber. Next question comes again from Nick. There are many examples of regulators allowing the inclusion of reduced maintenance and replacement capital, as well as fuel savings. Fuel savings alone won't pay for a renewable project off-grid. So that's a comment, and perhaps, Chris, you could reflect some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, for sure that we have seen that is incorporated into the OIC in the YUKON. They can be kind of tricky to get those reduced maintenance savings. So generally, maintenance on diesel generations is done on an hourly basis. So it depends on how much the generator is run over time. It's not always necessarily related to the amount of kilowatt hours it's producing. So for example, if you had a 1 megawatt generator and it's running at 1 megawatt, and then you add a solar farm, a 200 or 400 kilowatt solar farm, now it's running at the diesel generator would need to run at about 600 kilowatt hours, or a 600 kilowatt capacity, sorry. But it's still going to be running, so you're going to still have that hour. So you're absolutely right. If there is reduced maintenance, we have definitely seen that incorporated into legislation, and it is allowed to be part of the compensation for IPPs. And yeah, I definitely can appreciate that last comment. The fuel savings alone doesn't necessarily pay for the renewable project. I mean, they can be difficult to get off the ground, that's for sure.
Thanks, Chris. Amber, got a question for you here. What is Indigenous climate leadership? This comes from Aaron.
Yeah, thank you, Philip and Aaron. So within the clean energy space, Indigenous climate leadership means supporting and promoting Indigenous and community-led and owned clean energy projects and solutions, and overall a more prominent Indigenous role in the clean energy transition, which contributes to goals of energy security and greater energy sovereignty, self-determination, and reconciliation.
Thank you kindly. We've got a little more time, folks. And another question coming from Aaron. Can non-Indigenous communities organizations apply for this funding?
Yeah, thank you. So this is a great question. So funding is prioritized to Indigenous community led projects. So all applicants will be evaluated on their merit. However, you could still likely do well in project evaluation. So basically overall, the 300 million is targeted directly to support the government's commitment to supporting Indigenous communities transitioning from diesel. However, we do say that you still apply. Just be aware that funding is prioritized towards the Indigenous-led and community projects. Thank you.
Another follow-up for you, Amber. You mentioned 300 million Given you also mentioned there are 200 diesel-reliant communities, the 300 million seems that it might be a little bit low. Are there plans to request more funding to support that?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron and Philip. So we have committed to return for a larger proposal in 2024. This is why part of the work that we're doing in the hub right now is a large-scale engagement process with Indigenous communities and leaderships for our next steps. We do understand that $300 million does not fulfill the complete need, and there's no doubt that we have that there is more needed to fulfill this commitment. So we are actively reaching out to engage with the communities to see what needs they have, so we can identify what we would like to go for in the larger proposal in the coming years. Thank you.
Thanks, Amber, and thank you, Chris. There don't appear to be any further questions. So with that in mind, we want to thank everyone who took the time to listen to this, but perhaps prior to leaving, I'll just do a quick plug. We have next 2 webinar series coming up on our Sustainable Solutions series. The next one is Breaking Ground, and it'll take place Thursday, October the 20th. This webinar will focus on the engineering, procurement, and construction phases of clean energy projects, including tackling procurement and supply chain challenges. Additionally, we'll highlight the importance of how your project can also support local business and community growth. And then on the 24th, we'll conclude with the 4th series, Keeping the Lights On. In the final webinar, you will learn the ins and outs of how to manage the ongoing operational maintenance, take you through the steps to help organize the manufacturer's maintenance requirements and creating a successful maintenance plan. So for any further questions, please do not hesitate. You can contact me. My number and the email is listed there for you. And we'd love to answer any questions you may have. And thank you again for your time and attention. And we hope to see you again on our other webinars in the series and continue our journey on the project lifecycle of remote communities and clean energy projects. All the best.